Do you even know what a platoon is, old man? Lieutenant Miller's voice, sharp and laced with the easy arrogance of a man half David Carmichael's age and twice his rank, cut through the low hum of the command tent. Miller, a Navy SEAL with a physique that seemed carved from granite and an ego to match, gestured dismissively at the holographic map table. This is a live fire simulation, not a VFW hall meeting. So why don't you grab a cup of coffee and find a nice quiet corner to sit in before you get yourself hurt? David Carmichael, who had seen more than 80 summers, stood with a stillness that seemed to absorb the condescension. His hands, gnarled by time and labor, rested calmly at his sides. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, held a placid depth that betrayed nothing. He wore a simple, worn field jacket over a plain shirt, a stark contrast to the high-tech digital camouflage of the young operators filling the tent. The air crackled with the energy of the war game, a massive joint forces exercise designed to test the military's most elite units. And in the center of it all stood David, an apparent relic from a forgotten era. Another officer, a young lieutenant with eager eyes, chimed in. "With all due respect, sir, credentials are required in the command center. We don't have you on any roster." He tried to sound professional, but the undertone of annoyance was clear. They were the tip of the spear, the nation's finest, and this old man was a distraction, an anomaly they couldn't account for. Miller smirked, folding his arms across his chest. The gesture bunched his already impressive biceps, a silent display of physical dominance. "Look, Grandpa, we're busy here. This is important stuff. We're simulating a deep insertion coastal raid. It's complex. You wouldn't understand." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Just tell us who you are, who you're with, and we'll get you a nice safe ride back to the base where you belong." The circle of young officers around them watched, a mixture of amusement and impatience on their faces. They saw a confused civilian, a lost cause who had somehow wandered into the nerve center of a highly classified military exercise. They saw a problem to be managed. They had no idea they were the ones about to be managed. The tension in the command tent thickened with every passing second. Lieutenant Miller's smug challenge hung in the air, a blatant display of disrespect that made some of the more seasoned NCOs shift uncomfortably. David Carmichael, however, remained impassive. He had not come here to be the center of attention, but now that he was, he would see it through with the same quiet resolve that had defined his life. He simply held Miller's gaze, his silence a more potent response than any words could have been. "I asked you a question," Miller pressed, his voice hardening. The initial mockery was curdling into genuine irritation. "This is a restricted area. Your presence here is a security breach. Now who the hell are you?" He gestured to two of his men. "Escort him out, take him to the MPs and let them sort it out." The two SEALs moved forward, their movements economical and confident. They were trained for action, for removing obstacles, and right now the obstacle was an octogenarian in a faded jacket. "Sir, you need to come with us," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. He reached out to take David's arm. David didn't flinch. He simply shifted his stance slightly, a minuscule adjustment that nonetheless made the young operator pause. "I believe I was invited," David said, his voice calm and even, yet it carried an authority that cut through the background noise of the tent. It was not a loud voice, but it was the kind of voice men instinctively stop and listen to. Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Invited? By who? The Joint Chiefs themselves?" He looked around at his men, sharing the joke. "I'm the ranking officer in this tent, and I sure as hell didn't invite you. So for the last time, identify yourself." To emphasize his point, he pointed a finger at a small, weathered patch on David's jacket. It was a simple design, faded and frayed at the edges, depicting a coiled serpent. "What's that supposed to be? Your gardening club?" The insult meant to humiliate had an unintended effect. It drew every eye to the patch. It was unremarkable to the uninitiated, a meaningless piece of cloth. But David's hand drifted up, his thumb brushing over the worn threads, and for a fleeting moment the high-tech hum of the command tent seemed to fade away. The air wasn't filled with the cool, conditioned breeze of a command tent, but with the thick, humid heat of a jungle. The smell was of mud and sweat and fear. He was younger then, his face taut with the strain of command, his jacket soaked through. Around him a small team of men, ghosts in the dense foliage, looked to him for orders. They were deep in enemy territory, cut off, with no support. The patch on his arm was new then, its colors still vibrant. It was a symbol they had created for themselves, a quiet mark of defiance for a unit that officially didn't exist. They were on their own, with nothing but each other and the impossible mission ahead. He remembered the weight of the radio on his back, the whisper of the man next to him, a boy from Alabama who would never see home again. "We're with you, Skipper," the boy had said, to the end. The memory was a flash, a whisper of a past that was more real than the present. It was a lifetime ago, a promise made in the heart of darkness. He blinked, the holographic displays of the command tent sharpening back into focus. The young lieutenant's sneering face was inches from his. The past was a ghost, but it was a ghost that had shaped him, a presence that informed the stillness in his eyes. He had faced down men with rifles and bayonets, men who wanted his life. The arrogance of a young officer was nothing. While Miller and his team were focused on their public shaming of the old man, a young communications specialist in the corner of the tent, Specialist Jenkins, had been watching the entire exchange with growing unease. Jenkins was a quiet, observant soldier, more comfortable with signal arrays and encryption algorithms than with open confrontation. He had noticed the old man earlier, sitting quietly on a supply crate, watching the exercise unfold with an intensity that seemed out of place. He didn't look lost or confused. He looked like he was evaluating. When Miller had pointed out the old faded patch, something clicked in Jenkins's mind. He was a history buff, a student of military lore and the forgotten corners of special operations. He had seen that serpent emblem once before, in a dusty, declassified file he had stumbled upon during a late-night research binge. It was the insignia of a phantom unit, a MAC-VSOG precursor group from the Vietnam era, spoken of only in whispers. A unit that had been officially denied, its records sealed and its members scattered to the winds. Legends. Jenkins felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. The probability was infinitesimal, but if this old man was who he thought he might be, then Lieutenant Miller wasn't just being disrespectful, he was committing a monumental act of sacrilege. The young SEAL was dancing in a minefield he didn't even know existed. Jenkins knew he couldn't confront Miller directly. The lieutenant would dismiss him in an instant. He needed to go over his head, and fast. His fingers, trained to move with speed and precision over a keyboard, moved to his personal cell phone. He kept his head down, his eyes on his monitor, making it look like he was engrossed in his work. He pulled up a number from his contacts, a number he had been given once by a mentor and told to use only in the most extreme of circumstances. "Oh God," Evans breathed. It was not a curse but a prayer. "Keep him there. Do not, I repeat, do not let your lieutenant lay a hand on him. Stall them. I don't care how you do it. Tell Miller it's a security drill, a red team exercise, anything. I am on my way." "And Jenkins," the captain added, his voice now steel, "you did the right thing." The line went dead. "Tell him it's a code Sierra. Tell him David Carmichael is here." That was all he would need to say. The name was a key, one that unlocked doors and commanded instant, unquestioning respect at the highest levels of the military. He grabbed his cover from his desk and stormed towards the exit, his staff scrambling to keep up. The intricate multi-million-dollar war game he was supposed to be commanding had just become secondary. The real event was happening in a small tent 2 miles away, and he had to get there before a national hero was thrown in the brig. Back in the command tent, Lieutenant Miller's patience had finally snapped. The old man's quiet defiance was more infuriating than any outright resistance. It was a challenge to his authority, and in front of his men he could not let it stand. "That's it. I'm done asking," Miller declared, his voice ringing with finality. He looked at the 2 SEALs who were still standing near David. "I gave you an order. Remove this man from my tent and turn him over to the MPs. If he resists, cuff him." He then turned his attention back to David, his expression a mask of cold fury. "You, old man, are a threat to national security. For all I know, you're a spy, or maybe just a senile old fool who wandered off from the nursing home. Either way, you're about to find out what happens when you disrupt a United States military operation." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "By the time we're done with you, you'll be lucky if you ever see the outside of a federal psychiatric evaluation ward again." It was the ultimate overreach, a threat designed to break the old man's composure, to finally make him show fear. David Carmichael simply watched him, his expression unchanged, as if he were observing a storm cloud on the distant horizon. Just as the 2 SEALs reached for David's arms again, a sound from outside cut through the tense atmosphere of the tent. It started as a faint siren, a distant wail that grew rapidly in volume and intensity. Heads turned. The operators, trained to be hyper-aware of their surroundings, instinctively looked towards the entrance. The wail became a deafening shriek as a convoy of 3 black SUVs and a Humvee, lights flashing, screeched to a halt just yards from the tent's entrance. Doors flew open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Men in crisp, high-ranking uniforms began to disembark with a speed and purpose that signaled a major event. The first man out was Captain Evans, his face a grim mask of controlled panic. He was followed by the base's provost marshal and, to the utter astonishment of everyone watching, a two-star general, his uniform bristling with ribbons and decorations. They moved not with the casual pace of a routine visit, but with the focused urgency of a crisis response team. The sight of a general arriving in a lights and sirens convoy at a forward simulation tent was so unprecedented that it stopped everyone in their tracks. The young SEALs froze, their hands hovering just inches from David Carmichael. Lieutenant Miller stared, his mouth slightly agape, his threats and bravado instantly forgotten. The cavalry had arrived. Captain Evans burst through the flaps of the tent, his eyes scanning the interior with frantic intensity. The general and the other officers followed right on his heels, their presence immediately sucking all the air out of the room. The low hum of the servers and the chatter of the operators died into a stunned absolute silence. Evans's eyes landed on the small cluster of men in the center of the tent, the two SEALs, the arrogant lieutenant, and the old man in the faded jacket. Ignoring everyone else, Captain Evans marched directly towards David Carmichael. He came to a halt 2 feet in front of him, his posture ramrod straight. The entire tent held its breath. Then, in a movement that was sharp, precise, and filled with a reverence that bordered on awe, Captain Evans raised his hand to his brow and delivered the crispest, most formal salute of his career. "Mr. Carmichael," he said, his voice ringing with emotion and a profound, unmistakable respect. "Sir, it is an honor." Behind him, the two-star general also snapped to attention, his own hand raising in a salute to the old man in the civilian jacket. The rest of the officers followed suit. Within seconds, every uniformed person in the tent, from the lowest-ranking specialist to the highest-ranking general, was standing at rigid attention, saluting not a fellow officer but the unassuming old man who, just a moment before, had been threatened with arrest. Lieutenant Miller stood frozen, his arm half raised in a pathetic, reflexive imitation of the salute. His mind simply could not process what was happening. He looked from the general to the captain, then back to the old man, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. Captain Evans held his salute for a long moment before slowly lowering his hand. He turned to face the dumbfounded assembly of SEALs and operators. His eyes were like ice chips. "For those of you who are unaware," he began, his voice dangerously quiet but carrying to every corner of the tent, "allow me to introduce you to the man you have been so disrespectfully harassing." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This is David Carmichael, but you might know him by the name they gave his unit in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Skipper." A few of the older NCOs in the room inhaled sharply. The name was spoken in legends. "Mr. Carmichael is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross," Evans continued, his voice now rising with a righteous anger. "He was awarded the Silver Star not once but 3 times. He has 4 Bronze Stars for Valor and 5 Purple Hearts. He is credited with more than 70 successful deep-cover reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, operations that are still classified and will likely remain so for another 50 years. He was a founding member of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The tactics you are simulating in this very exercise," Evans gestured to the holographic map, "the ones you think are so advanced. He wrote them, he invented them, he perfected them in places you don't even have the security clearance to read about." He took a step towards Lieutenant Miller, who looked as if he might faint. "The patch you mocked on his jacket is the emblem of a unit that officially never existed. A unit that went into the darkest places on Earth and did the impossible with no expectation of recognition or reward. They were the Whispering Ghosts, and Mr. Carmichael was their commander." The silence in the tent was now one of pure, unadulterated shock. The young operators looked at David Carmichael with a new understanding, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and shame. They were looking at a living piece of history, a titan of their own profession whom they had mistaken for a feeble old man. Captain Evans let the revelation settle before delivering the final, crushing blow. "Mr. Carmichael isn't a security breach, Lieutenant. He is here today as a guest of the Secretary of Defense to observe our readiness. He was, in fact, invited by the Joint Chiefs themselves." Having laid bare the legend, Captain Evans turned his full, wrathful attention to Lieutenant Miller. The general stood silently by, his expression one of grim disappointment, allowing his subordinate to handle the dressing down. It was a more powerful statement than if he had yelled himself. "Lieutenant," Evans said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal tone, "you are an officer in the United States military. You wear the uniform of a Navy SEAL. You are expected to be the best of the best. And yet you have shown a lack of judgment, humility, and basic human decency that is frankly staggering." He stepped closer, invading Miller's personal space. "You didn't just disrespect a civilian. You disrespected a hero of this nation. You disrespected the very foundations upon which your own elite unit is built. You looked at a man who has bled more for this country than you could possibly imagine, and you saw nothing but a target for your own arrogance. Miller stood rigid, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, I didn't know," he stammered. "That is the entire point, Lieutenant." Evans shot back. "You are not paid to know. You are paid to have the wisdom to not assume, to treat every single person with a measure of respect until they prove they deserve otherwise. You failed that test. You failed it in front of your men, and you have brought shame upon your unit and this command." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You are relieved of your command in this exercise, effective immediately. Report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. We will have a very long conversation about your future." Evans then turned away from the disgraced lieutenant and back to David. His demeanor softened instantly. "Carmichael, on behalf of everyone here, I offer you our most sincere and humble apologies." David Carmichael simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He looked not at the captain but at the young, shame-faced lieutenant. When he finally spoke, his voice was not triumphant or angry, but quiet and thoughtful, the voice of a teacher. "Son," he said, addressing Miller directly, "the most dangerous enemy you will ever face is your own pride. It blinds you to the truth. It deafens you to wisdom. The quiet man in the corner, the one you dismiss, might be the one who holds the key to your survival." He gently touched the faded serpent patch on his own jacket. "This piece of cloth doesn't mean anything. The man wearing it does. Remember that." The jacket was stiff with dried mud and blood, his own and that of the man he was carrying. He stumbled through the jungle, every step in agony. He was the last one left, the only one still moving. The rescue chopper was miles away and an enemy patrol was closing in. He could hear their dogs. He laid the wounded radioman down gently behind a banyan tree. The boy was pale, his breathing shallow. "Go on, Skipper," the boy whispered, his hand weakly gesturing to the coiled serpent patch on David's sleeve. "Leave me. It's our code. Mission first." David looked at the patch, then back at the dying boy. "The mission is you," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. He ripped the patch from his own sleeve and pressed it into the boy's hand. "This is for you. You earned it." He then picked the boy up and continued his impossible journey. The fallout from the incident in the command tent was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Miller was formally reprimanded and reassigned. He was also required to develop and lead a new training module for junior officers, focusing on military history, heritage, and the importance of humility and leadership. It was a punishment designed not just to correct his behavior but to force him to internalize the lesson he had learned in the most public and humiliating way possible. The story of the incident spread like wildfire through the special operations community, a cautionary tale for a new generation of warriors. Weeks later, a formal handwritten letter of apology from Miller arrived at David Carmichael's quiet rural home. David read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer without comment. Months passed. The seasons changed. One crisp autumn afternoon, David was at a local hardware store picking out some bolts for a fence he was mending. As he stood in the aisle comparing threads, a man approached him. It was Miller, dressed in civilian clothes. He looked different without his uniform, smaller and more subdued. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there for a moment, his eyes filled with a humility that had not been there before. He gave a short, respectful nod to the old man. David Carmichael looked up from the bolts in his hand. He met the young man's gaze and, after a quiet moment, returned the nod. It was a silent exchange, an acknowledgement of a lesson learned and a moment of grace offered. Miller then turned and walked away, leaving David to his task. The old hero returned his attention to the bolts, the quiet rhythm of his life undisturbed, his greatness once again hidden in plain sight. Stories of valor remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the quietest and most unassuming forms. Their legacy is not just in the medals they earned, but in the wisdom they carry. If you were inspired by this story, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes.